I'm Meea Kang, and I'm Senior Vice President with Related California. I'm also a director for the Council of Infill Builders, which is an advocacy organization that helps to educate policymakers around the challenges of building infill housing.
I see. Thank you. So could you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges facing all home developers in California?
There is a lot of layers of complication when it comes to building new construction in California. Senator Wiener with SB 35 was able to address some of those concerns with by right zoning for 100% affordable housing and housing with some affordability. So that has been a game changer in sort of creating some level of certainty for housing. It's very complicated to get housing approved, especially new housing and especially housing for low-income individuals and most especially housing for the formerly homeless. Part of it is because in California, many of these approvals are discretionary. And so when a project comes forward to a city to say, I'd like to build some affordable housing, and potentially there's even housing for homeless, as you can imagine, that doesn't necessarily bode well with neighbors. And so, it has been a stymied effort in some cases to try to get housing built because frankly, community opposition or NIMBYs, as we call it, not in my backyard. So addressing those issues with tools like SB 35 has been helpful. The state has also come up with things called density bonus law that allows for existing sites to have increases in density because of, again, the state's desire to see more housing. Because we have a system of what's called local control, a lot of cities control their zoning and their municipalities. And part of it is a balance of public services, whether it be fire, police, storm drainage. The cities are strapped in order to kind of deal with infrastructure needs and support services. So in some cases, housing is seen as being a burden to some jurisdictions because in some cases they may view it as housing is more expensive. It costs cities more money to develop. However, there's also the benefit of growing cities. In many cities in California, especially cities with really fantastic school districts, like say Piedmont, California, for example, you see declining enrollment of existing elementary schools because of the fact that people don't move and new families are unable to move into high-performing school districts for a variety of reasons. And so we have a lot of challenges as to siting housing. Where can we put the housing? How do we grow sustainably to also meet our climate goals? As you know, we have way back in the day, AB 32 set a standard for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and the state recognizing that global warming and climate change, one of the primary reasons for that was the amount of driving that Californians do, the amount of driving of individual people in one car. We used to say you drive until you couldn't afford it. So many homes are built far outside urban centers. And back in the day when we all went to work every day, it was an issue where traffic and congestion was just part of everyone's daily routine. But those idling of cars, all of that leads to greater GHG emissions, which we all know leads to really unpredictable climate change. So we've also seen the issue of wildfires in remote areas where there's housing and existing housing. And then the desire for many folks right now in the legislature to say, let's just not build anywhere near trees, or let's not build anywhere where we fear that there may be danger. We have things like earthquake. We have things like sea level rise. We have so many concerns that relate to climate change, which all kind of comes back to how we drive, which then all kind of comes back to where do we place housing? And so, one of the key challenges is finding a site for housing. And then another key challenge in building affordable housing is where do you get the funds to do it? When we build affordable housing, it's often used with low-income housing tax credits, which is a federal program called Section 48. It's an IRS program that allows for states like California to get tax credits, which then are sold to a tax investor, which then you're able then to layer in additional funds to build housing. The challenge, though, with building housing in California in a regulated market is that a lot of policy goals are also woven into every project, which is admirable, laudable. We do fantastic projects that are what are we calling transit-oriented development, so building denser housing near transit, so like say BART, for example, so that we can get people out walking, and out, if they're walking, they're healthier. If they're walking, getting out of their cars, they're less stressed. And in some cases, if they're out and about, they're also supporting local businesses. However, the cost to do that housing continues to escalate. We have labor shortages right now. We have material shortages. When we have the high cost of skilled and trained labor that now is becoming almost a mandate in all new programs. And so by the rising cost of materials, the rising cost of labor, the cost of housing, it becomes, incredibly difficult to support, especially when you're building affordable housing, which has to be deed restricted affordable for 55 years. I know that was a lot. But,
oh, that's great. That's wonderful. I mean, I have so many questions as you were talking, and I try to retrieve a few. One is, so I talked with sort of like an acquaintance, and he's my friend's husband. He's a small-time developer in Palo Alto, and he had the worst time trying to get his development project approved. I mean, not to mention just SIEPR and committee meetings and this and that. And I just feel like, why do we, I mean, his project is not low-income housing, just a regular small 3-floor small house, building. Why do we have so much bureaucracy in California, but not elsewhere?
I think, certainly the issue of land use, a lot of folks have opinions. And when a project, so if somebody was to own, someone owns a house and they decide we're going to add a little addition to the backyard, or even an ADU now, accessory dwelling unit, that's pretty much easy to do. You go to the counter, you tell the planner what you'd like to do, and then you go forward, once they say yes. But when we do new construction, or we may need to change, a lot of times existing zoning doesn't permit multifamily. There's something wrong with the zoning. Maybe the setbacks are too great, or they restrict the height limit for a building. So, in many cases, I'm dealing with this in a certain particular area right now, where the zoning says you can build 15 units to the acre, but they cap it at 2 stories. They cap, and they make you do lots of parking. So they do all these things to make it impossible to actually achieve the zoning that's permitted on the site because of other constraints and other regulatory barriers that, and maybe in some cases are unintentional. They don't realize that they can't get what they've zoned for because of other certain factors. But it's also a way to stymie development, because a lot of small communities don't want to grow. A lot of small communities are in situations where the people who are elected by the people are no growth advocates, and they often call themselves preservationists. So they're all about keeping everything the same, and their job is to keep status quo. Because once you do something different, change is scary. And I think people think, I don't want my neighborhood to change. It's already bad enough with traffic. It's all, already takes me too long to go to the grocery store, or I can't find parking anymore in my street. And oftentimes parking is a proxy for why people don't want housing. And then the compromise then is that the communities will say, well, then I want to see so much parking per unit that it tanks the deal. Like you can't make it work because there's just not enough land, or you can't go high enough. And so, over the years, there's been many creative ways to stop development, even if it's good development. And so having, like a bill like SB 35 that Senator Wiener proposed and was able to get through allowed for certainty, so that we didn't have to have discretionary hearings. So in other words, neighbors, because oftentimes people inflame their perspectives. So they send out leaflets or big, next door announcements that the world's going to fall apart because this new housing development's coming in. And so every neighbor comes out and says, no, no, no. And it's usually just a complaint session about all the things that they're unhappy with in the city, but they're putting it all on this new housing. And so then they scapegoat future development over the problems of the past. So, it's just, that's one challenge. And I think because new construction is held to a much higher standard, everything becomes harder to do. It's more expensive to build because now you're building, I've built some of the very first net zero buildings where we're creating as much power on the solar as the tenants used. And, getting things like that through is also very challenging. and even at a
Shouldn't that be
regulatory
like,
level.
that sounds to me to be like should be pretty popular and should be welcomed, right? Because you're not increasing any energy use.
Well, when you're a pioneer, it's really hard, especially if you're a pioneer in an existing community. So one of the things also we have is Prop 13. So Prop 13, we all know, is a system in California where we set the property tax based on the original value that it was at the time of sale. And as you can imagine, many homes, especially in some of the most elite communities, were purchased maybe 40, 50 years ago. And that assessed value was considerably low. And they're paying, frankly, a subsidized property tax. Because when they sell that home, it could go up in some cases like 100%, depending on what they purchased it for. It's not uncommon to see now in places like San Francisco, even in the Sunset, where it's $1 million over asking price and they're selling for astronomical prices. So what that means then is that there is an idea that the people who are living in the houses want to make sure that they protect their values. And anything that changes that, any more people might have an effect on their values. So I think and then you also have communities that, because of that, those lower property base values, the jurisdiction doesn't have enough money to pay for infrastructure improvements, police and fire, raising costs of union dues and unfunded liabilities and all the things that, just the cost of doing business in California provides. So you just get, it's a very deep rooted problem that allows for folks to stake out territory in protecting without seeing the greater picture.
Right. I mean, something you just said something that's really interesting. You said the government, because the assessment value of existing house was based on like values from decades ago, was very low, and then therefore like the tax revenue for the local government is relatively low. And shouldn't that incentivize the government to build more new housing, because then they can get more new revenues?
One would think.
Right.
One would think, but I think there's
I'm not familiar with this. I'm just like, there's a quick thinking. I don't know what
a lot of times it's fear of change and fear of new people, and fear of, and let's just take it all the way back to redlining. Yeah. Let's take it all the way back to FHA mortgages and realtors steering, Black homeowners to a certain part of town and white owners to another part of town. Mm-hmm. I mean, it really goes back, in my opinion, to systemic racism as well.
Right. So if you, I want to respect your time. I know you're a very busy person. If you could change maybe like 3 things tomorrow, say if Senator Winner can write something out tomorrow and change it to make your life as a developer, especially a developer for low-income families, make your life a lot easier, what would the 3 things be?
We need a new funding source. We had lost something called redevelopment, which was frankly the most valuable tool that we had in our coffers in California for redeveloping communities. Partly because, again, Prop 13, there isn't a lot of money to invest in infrastructure. So if you go from a vacant piece of land in an infill area and you're the first one to build 100 units and before it was nothing, that first developer is the first out of the gate. They have to improve all the infrastructure around there to support that 100 units, even though nothing else is, even though no one else pays into it. And so having, say, a structure in which we can finance really critical infrastructure improvements to help all communities without putting on the back of new construction would be a big game changer. To be able to say yes with a lot more certainty to any kind of housing, whether it's senior housing, family housing, special needs housing, without having to, frankly, negotiate and have a lot of extractions from projects. So in order to get to yes, oftentimes developers have to agree to do all kinds of things, build an urban park, build a library, build a new school, do all kinds of things. And frankly, it makes it harder to get the housing built. So that would be another opportunity. And then I think having the ability for people to accept density, accept making room, accept looking at our underutilized properties all over California. Everybody knows it. We have strip malls that are half empty now. We have We have defunct factories that used to be a factory town, but now you have these empty buildings. I've got a couple of bills right now that I'm working with legislators on. One is a statewide adaptive reuse bill to look at old buildings so that we can do an adaptive reuse to help cities that don't have the capacity to do all the zoning and planning that it takes to do this. The state comes in with these tools that allows cities to do this by right, allowing them to have cover. In a way, we call it CYA, a little cover, so the locals don't get attacked. The local officials don't get attacked for saying yes to housing, because the state says we're in a housing crisis and we've got to do this. So you make room. So I have another bill that's looking at expansion of RCFEs, which is residential care facilities for the elderly. We have a law on the books from 1986 that really caps residential care homes for the elderly at 6 people and no more, even though you have a house that could easily satisfy 7 people, 8 people, 9 people. We can't do it. So we're not even expanding the existing footprints of existing communities in which we can create more capacity. We have an aging population, that's growing rapidly. The average age of life now is 85 years old. And over half of the homeless population in California, 160,000, are seniors, and many of them first-time homeless. And so we're not addressing the issues at hand here, and we're not doing it fast enough. So speed, people need to act like there's a real crisis, and we need to do things differently. I have another project I'm doing right now where we're looking at the first tiny homes on wheels, tiny homes for the homeless that I'm hoping to build in Sacramento that would really expedite approvals and expedite construction. And just looking at different ways to solve this problem. It doesn't always have to be platinum plated, 100% net zero buildings for every single individual. We can come up with better solutions that are better than a tough shed.
Mm-hmm. I want to follow up on what you said about the empty lots or vacant lots. We can see everywhere, even on El Camino in Palo Alto, which is a extremely expensive place. And I see empty lots everywhere. Who is supposed to develop them, and why are they not developed?
So many times these properties are either held in trust, think about, family trust or whatnot. And folks are also waiting for astronomical prices. So, it's shocking to see what people pay for real estate in Palo Alto. I saw some tiny sliver of land by a freeway being sold for $30 million. It's astronomical. And so I think you have a lot of folks waiting, and there's nothing to incentivize them to build housing. So these property owners, they're not developers. So they don't know what can be done, or they're waiting for someone to give them some astronomical offer, or the zoning doesn't permit housing. The zoning, it's a lot easier in some communities to build a fast food drive-in on commercial land than to build a mixed use housing development. And in many cases also, it's a lot easier for someone to build a 15-bedroom house where they can rent each room out than it is to build 15 units.
Why is that? So
it's the system. System, in many communities, the systems really reward, and they want single family homes. They want for sale. There is a belief in many jurisdictions that for sale housing is the American dream. It's what everybody wants. It's how you keep certain communities exclusive, right? Because you can only afford to buy in. How many folks can buy into Atherton? Does Atherton care to build lots of workforce housing? No.
Right.
So you have these exclusive enclaves that are pretty much dedicated to for sale homes. And with that, they control their school districts. They'll pay everybody will pay. And anytime there's a supplemental school bond, they always say yes. Anytime there's anything that sort of supports this very, exclusive quality of life, it's very much supported within the context of we're just supporting our community. There's very little regionalism. Even though everybody knows you can shop in one city because you just pass over to the other, you get gas in another city, you go, we all travel from one community to another. We don't think about where our sales tax is going. But in reality, it's a region. Right. And we don't think, and I think as a region, we need to start thinking more collectively about how we're all going to share and get our fair share of housing and services.
So what do you think about developing in more inland areas in California, and also bring back that high-speed rail that has been developed and discussed a lot, but it seems like it's not going very well.
Unfortunately, I did spend a lot of time working with high-speed rail during some of the in the last couple of years. It's super challenging the way that the high-speed rail was set up under its charter. It also needs to pay for itself. The challenges of going through SIEPR has made it impossible for the state to get the kind of roadway easements that they needed. Kind of figuring out how to get through some of the most challenging terrains and mountains has been really hard for the train to get from San Francisco to LA easily. And so Governor Newsom, of course, changed the route in phase 1. So it's really more Central Valley. I think the promise of more affordable homes in Fresno and Merced is absolutely possible. And I think these communities are absolutely changing. I think we have to commit always. Big infrastructure projects are really hard for taxpayers to understand and swallow and realize, why does it cost so much? I think we look at the Bay Bridge, for example. It took over 2 decades to get that bridge built. But now every time people drive over it, there is a wonderful, feeling of accomplishment that after the Loma Prieta earthquake, this new, very critical connection has been made and stabilized, just like BART. It took many years for BART to happen. I mean, BART to get to San Jose, how many years did that happen? So it is about keeping a long range vision for how long it's going to take to do these infrastructure projects, but sticking to it. Because it will get, I think the biggest thing about high-speed rail, it's also going to remove planes from the sky, because it's a lot easier for folks, just to hop on a plane and be in Burbank for lunch.
Right. But
it's the Bay Area.
I feel like, for the train, it will be much more useful if it's like a cluster, it goes from San Francisco all the way to, go to different small cities or inland rural areas. And then that can allow people to live far away, but still commute to the city to work. But right now, it seems like as of now, it's not going that direction.
I think that's right. I think, again, it's really political. Infrastructure projects are very political because it's going through things like people's ag farms, and they're buying land and they're changing the way land is being used. I think it's wrought with really difficult challenges around. I think the route was a complete political compromise. Where can they buy it? How can they buy it? What land's available? And, as a result, it's not ideal. But I think as a Californian, we just have to accept it and hope that something like this can occur, because we know that there will be economic stimulus. We know that people from far away will drive to a train, park their car, hopefully buy and eat something along the way, and get on the train and go to their destination seamlessly and, with all electric without any carbon.
Right.
So I think, especially now with gas prices at $6 a gallon, if people could get on a train and get to LA for $50, I guarantee they'll do it.
Yeah.
But it has to be there, and people have to have faith that we can get there. But if we pull the plug now, we've just lost. We've lost years and years of investment in funds.
Do you think infrastructure construction is particularly slow in California compared to other places?
Yes. But I think other places, like, you think about the big dig in Boston, how long that took. But I recently was in Boston last summer, and what a game changer. What a game changer having public transit in Boston was, in terms of just being able to get around without a car. Yeah. I think, we love to compare, the high-speed rail with places like China and in Japan, where it works so efficiently. But it's also, we have those places have a different system of government.
Yeah,
and
they don't have to talk with the tenants, and then they can just get people out. Like, in fact, the apartment building that I grew up with were just purchased by the government at a very low price to build subway.
Yeah. But then they do really smart things, like in Japan, in the high-speed rail stations, it's an incredible economy of shopping, of hotels, of offices, all strategically woven together. Braided together, the way that you finance it, the way that the sales tax dollars, whatever revenues come from it, all sort of work together and support each other.
Right.
And we have all these different interests. We're a bit splintered in California. And because government has to perform in the ways government has to perform, and each thing is political, decisions are made, it becomes challenging to kind of have that singular vision. And so it really does take, I think, a test of leadership and also advocacy. So groups like yours, I mean, you get Nobel Prize winners to write white papers. That's the kind of stuff that people in the legislature listen to, because they think, okay, if Stanford says this is a good idea, maybe this is a good idea, let's give it a try. So, it does help. And I think, the bottom up or top down or advocacy, that's why I spend a tremendous amount of my time volunteering to advocate, because many people don't understand what it's like on the ground to be a developer, understand the politics at local government level, and just the inherent challenges of just getting anything built in California.
I guess in light of time, my last question for you, this is just like a sort of like an intellectual exercise that I've heard from elsewhere, from the East Coast. And they say, well, if you have a lot of resistance from local residents when you want to increase density, they have the right to say that, because when they purchase the house, there is a built-in expectation this house is going to increase in value in the future. So why don't we just compensate them financially when we want to increase density? Do you think that's something that's worth discussing? No.
No, not at all. God, no. Horrible.
I ask everybody about this because I just feel like, is that something that can work in practice?
In my opinion, no. I don't think we should tie them together. I think homeowners who are lucky enough to have bought their homes with their own dollars or inherited their homes, they're on their own. But those interests cannot compete with the state's interest of sustainability and the future economy growth of California. I mean, for the first time in California's history in a long time, we saw more people leaving the state than coming into the state. We have an exodus now of really high-skilled workforces that are moving to Texas, that are moving to Idaho, because they can't afford housing. And they would prefer to be here. And so I think that that's why the state does need to come into play here and sort of find ways to, frankly, bypass, in some cases, your schoolyard antics, just some of the bullying tactics that goes on at the street level, to say, this is so important. We have to do everything we can to build, housing units. And frankly, even though we know that there are about 161,000 people on the streets homeless every day in California, unhoused, there's a heck of a lot more people who are teetering on the edge of homelessness right now.
Yeah, doubling up or just, in between different transitional housing. Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Meea, for speaking with me today. This is great. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.